Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another podcast hosted by the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies, which we will refer to as the Task Force. Today, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Lorraine McGowan, who is one of the three founding co-chairs of the task force, and Elizabeth Kocienda, who is the City Bar Director of Advocacy within the City Bar Policy Department. Both of them will introduce themselves in more detail shortly. My name is Jerome Walker, and I will moderate this podcast. By way of background, like Lorraine, I am one of the founding co-chairs of the task force. Ed So is the other founding co-chair. Ed stepped down from the task force in June, and he was succeeded by Tiffany Smith, who, like Lorraine and me, are the current task force co-chairs. Today's podcast will be both celebratory and educational. We are here to celebrate the New York governor's signing into law of a bill that we refer to as the bill to modernize the New York Uniform Commercial Code. Lorraine, Elizabeth, and I will celebrate that achievement and explain how the City Bar, led by the Policy Department and the task force, played a primary role in leading the effort in New York. It is not an exaggeration to assert that the City Bar was the key player in persuading policymakers to modernize the New York UCC, which had not been updated since 2014. After the three of us provide some historical context and explain the role of the City Bar in this effort, I will introduce Massachusetts Uniform Law Commissioner and Task Force member Edwin Smith and New York Uniform Law Commissioner and Task Force Special Advisor Neil Cohen, who will explain the process followed by the Uniform Law Commission and American Law Institute, who ultimately adopted the model UCC amendments to modernize the UCC generally. And they will explain key provisions of the modernized New York UCC. Let's get started. Lorraine, would you please introduce yourself in more detail?
Sure. So Lorraine McGowan, I'm a partner at Orrick Harrington and Sutcliffe and its restructuring group. And I'm also co-chair with you on the Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence and Digital Technologies. I am a former vice president and board member of the City Bar.
Yeah, you have played a lot of roles, and I'm going to focus today on a lot of information that I don't think people know. That is, from my standpoint and for history, it's extremely important from a context standpoint that everybody knows that this entire thing started with you. Actually, if you were to go back in time, approximately, say, 5 years ago, when you were a vice president of the City Bar, indeed, you and Maria Salente, Maria's formerly with the City Bar Policy Department, but you guys consulted with the City Bar president at the time, Susan Coleman, and your initial take was to establish an informal working group to focus on what was then referred to as the 2022 amendments to Uniform Commercial Code that were proposed by the Uniform Law Commission, American Law Institute. That informal working group was succeeded by the task force. But the key point from a historical context is all of this stuff started in your mind. So I want to take you back to a time when there was no working group. There was no task force. There was only a Lorraine McGowan. And Lorraine McGowan was trying to figure out how to help the City Bar get his arms around these developing technologies, and in particular to help the City Bar determine the role that it would play in terms of the modernization of the New York UCC. So let's start from that point. What really caused you to start thinking about it in that way?
So I have to give shout out to former President Susan Coleman. And as I was the vice president, each of us were asked to, as vice presidents, as officers, to identify a project that we would undertake in order to assist the city bar in expanding its reach. And so I was working I'm a commercial lawyer, and I knew that the Uniform Law Commissioners was going to be recommending to the states the adoption of the 22 UCC amendments. And I thought it would be great if the city bar would be very actively involved in getting New York to enact the UCC amendments. My hope was that we would be one of the first states to enact the UCC amendments by getting us involved, as you said, almost 5 years ago. But it started with that idea that I wanted to get the city bar to be at the forefront in helping New York to adopt the UCC amendment. And working with Maria, we knew that there wasn't yet another committee involved in tokenization, modernization of the UCC. So we wanted to, as you mentioned, form an informal group that could work across all of the city bar committees that are particularly affected by commercial law issues to be involved in helping to prepare a report regarding the issues associated with enactment of the UCC amendments. What were the issues unique to New York in that regard? There are several provisions under the New York UCC that are unique, that are not part of the uniform laws on secure transactions. So we wanted to make sure that the New York specific issues would be incorporated into any report or work product that we had. And to the extent that modifications to the UCC, that there were any modifications to the UCC to incorporate the New York position, that those were taken into account. So it started 5 years ago because we wanted the city bar to be in a preeminent role in helping to modernize the UCC in New York.
I remember during that period of time, you and Maria, so you guys pulled together a very large group of us from various city bar committees. And I remember in the initial meeting that you guys called where you pulled us together, I remember you were saying that we need to decide and make recommendations on what the city bar's position would be on this proposed 2022 amendments. By the way, the 2022 amendments at that time were not even adopted yet. And so one of the first things that you had us do was to bring in Ed Smith and ask Ed Smith, along with a reporter for the UCC 2022 amendments, to make a presentation to the city bar. And I remember during that period of time and that presentation, we were able to ask a range of questions to the experts who were drafting it. And you had particular concerns that while we are talking about the Uniform Commercial Code, New York is one of those states where New York decides how uniform or not uniform its Uniform Commercial Code is. So I remember particularly making sure that we address the differences between the Uniform Commercial Code that was adopted as a model uniform law across the nation. And it's funny because Neil said that the way to think about New York is New York should really be called the substantially uniform commercial code because it's not really, uniform. So could you talk about what your thinking was when you brought in the experts to make a presentation to us? And I particularly remember you're pulling in groups. For example, there were consumer protection groups that you pulled in. There was energy groups that you pulled in, a range of people. So it seems to me that what you were trying to do was get the city bar to have a diverse representation of views to make sure it was dressed. Did I get that wrong, or was that your thinking?
No, that was my thinking. And, as we thought about this, so the Uniform Commercial Code provides that it governs many issues, but it refers to applicable other state law or other laws on certain matters. So as we looked at how to educate our constituents about the proposed amendments and what New York's position ought to be in connection with modifications to sorry about that, whether there were any New York specific modifications to the uniform laws that needed to be made. We also wanted to make sure that we had the views of all of the relevant stakeholders. So that was one of the reasons why I reached out to you, for example, because you were involved in many of the committees on a regulatory standpoint. And so we needed to make sure that we had the views of people involved in regulatory issues and compliance issues and consumer protection and energy, because part of the legislation would address transactions involving crypto, for example. And we wanted to make sure that in making recommendations for New York, we took a very holistic approach in soliciting the views and concerns of all of the stakeholders.
I also remember during this period of time, you and Maria were pretty clear. Let's start with a report. And the report would have to lay out a basis that would explain to policymakers why it's so important to modernize the UCC and address the different provisions. And I remember you guys laying out a timeline. Well, the timeline didn't exactly work and there were complications, but I'd like you to talk about why you made sure that there were so many different voices involved in the drafting. For example, it is absolutely true that Alan Collard, for example, who was then the chair of the Uniform State Laws and Commercial Law Committee, Alan was absolutely brilliant in pulling together subject matter experts, and they did a first draft. But I could remember you and I reviewing, because Alan would send the drafts in to us. There were at least 18 different versions that we worked on to try to get the tone right, to make sure specific issues were addressed, strategic choices on certain things. So what was your thinking in terms of having subject matter experts, but also having a wide range of people to make sure that the explanation that was provided was not just a technical explanation, but it was also pragmatic explanation that focused on how it would affect the various stakeholders? What was going through your mind when you started to make sure the report was shaped in that way?
So thanks, Jerome, for the question. So as you know, working with our policy department, Maria and then Elizabeth, the focus wasn't just on issuing a report that addressed what the issues were, but to work with the stakeholders and the various committees to get the 22 UCC amendment enacted, because we wanted as our preeminent goal for New York to remain, the global center for commercial transactions, and the jurisdiction for resolving or addressing commercial disputes. And so we knew early on that getting New York to enact the 22 UCC amendments was critically important. And in order to achieve that objective, we needed to make sure that we had identified and addressed the concerns of all of the different stakeholders. So because the city bar, as representing practitioners in a variety of practice areas, would want to be able to articulate to the legislators and the governor's office that we had already collected the viewpoint of various practitioners and address any concerns that they might have to the passage. So it was very important early on that we be as diverse in the viewpoints that we collected so that the city bar could report to the legislators and the governor's office and other stakeholders that we solicited the viewpoints of practitioners across all spectrums that would be affected by the UCC amendments. So it was in part education, but also in part soliciting support for the passage of the 22 amendments.
Yeah, so in drafting a complex technical report that we're talking about, so you could have, and we did have, a situation where the subject matter experts were focusing on internal consistencies, for example, within the UCC, taking into account the different other articles and how they work together. But you went beyond that because, for example, you wanted to address whether or not whatever the New York amendments that modernize the UCC would assure that businesses that were contemplating bringing their digital transactions into New York or who were engaging in digital transactions within New York, you wanted to make sure that the report was written in a way that it would appeal to those stakeholders because you were worried that if it was just a technical draft, the problem is a technical draft might get you where you want to be in terms of the statute that would ultimately be enacted or the revisions or the new bill, but it wouldn't address the business concerns of stakeholders who had to operate in New York. You also wanted to make sure that New York policymakers understood that in the digital world, New York had not positioned itself yet like it had in the non-digital world. And so you had various other states who wanted to be the preferred law, have their states be the preferred law, have their courts be the preferred arbiters of any of the disputes. You wanted to make sure that the report addressed those and the report addressed efficiency issues as well. So you wanted the tone of the report to be more than just a technical report that just technical subject matter experts. You wanted policymakers to understand what it meant for the New York economy. Why was that so important to you?
So, Jerome, as you know, the technology is moving very quickly. It's rapidly and it's changing. And so part of it was also educating our constituents about the new technology and how it would be applied in a pragmatic way. So, for example, through your efforts, and we started with this with the initial report, but we created programs for small businesses. We created programs on how this new technology is affecting financing transactions involving crypto and other digital assets and tokenizing transactions, as well as what the litigation or legal risks and regulatory risks are associated with this new emerging technology. So from an early standpoint, it was making sure constituents were aware from a practical standpoint regarding this new technology and how modernizing the UCC will actually help their transactions.
Thanks, Lorraine. Now I'd like to turn it over to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, would you please introduce yourself in more detail? And then I'll have some questions for you about the policy department.
Sure. So I'm Elizabeth Kocienda. I'm the director of advocacy at the City Bar, and I work with our policy department to help facilitate any sort of advocacy lobbying that the City Bar committees want to do on behalf of a position. So in the case of this particular issue, once we had a stated position in support of the bill, it was my job to come in and basically help us get to the finish line of actually getting the policy enacted. And that includes everything from getting the bill introduced, finding sponsors, finding allies, coming up with an advocacy plan, and helping the committee through each step of the process, which is, multi-layered and a lot of different work in different areas that we can get into. But it's really to shepherd our policy recommendations through, ideally, to a successful outcome.
Yeah, so I want to take you back because I think this is a teaching moment. Because, while Lorraine, Tiffany, and I are co-chairs of the task force, there's over 150 different City Bar committees. Some of them may not have worked as closely with the policy department as we have. So I want to try to help them because this is an enormous success that the policy department has driven for the City Bar and the task force. So could you start with the point at which Lorraine and I came to you after we had completed a report that essentially took the position that New York should modernize the UCC. And so we came to you and we said, hey, Elizabeth, how do we get from the point at which we have a report, because that's all we had was a report, and how do we get it through the legislature to the governor's office and having the governor sign? So if you don't mind taking into account that these chairs are going to be listening, what is the ideal way to approach the policy department? And what are some of the asks? And I can get into some of the asks that we made of you, but it was extraordinary support. And I mean, from us having nothing to your guiding a process over the course of multiple years through the legislative process, through the executive process. Could you please fill in the blanks for chairs that might be listening to this?
So when a committee takes a position, as you know, it's a strenuous process. They go through, depending on the committee, it can be a multi-month, sometimes year-long process of writing a report. And a lot of thought and consideration goes into that, a lot of internal collaboration. So when it gets to us, when it gets to me, I should say, we know that it's been through a lot of deliberations and a lot of different people have seen it. So my goal is really to take the report and figure out how do we make it into something that is not just something that the Bar Association speaks to, but we can get legislators to understand, their staff to understand, and also other stakeholders, and come up with a plan to see that's tailored to that specific report and that specific issue that will help us achieve a goal, which in this case was to get a bill passed through the state legislature. So I start by trying to understand the issue myself. As a non-lawyer who comes at this from a government relations standpoint, it sometimes is helpful to have somebody who's not actually a lawyer looking at it because it can help me craft our messaging in a way that will be understandable to maybe more of a layperson. And then we also try to take a look at the specific needs of the report. So in this case, identifying sponsors that could understand the issue, really run with it, be champions for it, figuring out the right committees that the bill was likely going to have to go through. So that way we could start identifying sponsors that may be aligned with those committees and potential legislators that we would need to be reaching out to because they sit on those committees. and thinking through what the kind of timeline of the legislative process is going to look like, where we are in session, and what we need to do kind of short-term, long-term to see the bill through. So for this particular bill, we finished this report, I want to say mid-session when it was issued. So it was a very large bill. And to get a bill like that introduced and passed when session had already started we pretty much knew from the get-go was not going to be possible. So the goal then is to really identify somebody who could get the bill introduced for us in a way that would put us in the best position to be able to have the bill reintroduced and move in the following year. So that's what we tried to do. We figured this is a bill that needs to sit in the Judiciary Committee. Senator Brad Hoylman-Siegel is the Judiciary Committee chair. He's sponsored bills like this in the past that are kind of more uniform laws. He would be a great choice. And so that's why we started. And that's where kind of from the get-go, we start thinking about that type of strategy. The other thing that we always ask committees to be thinking about when they're doing advocacy is who are your allies? Who are going to be groups that can get involved so that the city bar isn't the only voice speaking on this? We obviously knew from the beginning that the Uniform Law Commission was going to be our key partner because this was their legislation in collaboration with us. So we wanted to make sure that we were coordinating with them from the beginning, but also looking to outside groups. And that's really where a combination of, research that we do internally, but also pulling on the resources of our committees and your connections, your knowledge of the field and all other groups that may be involved is really helpful because we were able to identify a number of different organizations that were able to sign on and support the bill over the course of our advocacy work. And having those other voices involved is really key to getting any sort of legislation passed.
So you made a decision to have us look, as you said, at Senator Hoylman-Siegel. You also had us check in with Borres. So you covered the Senate and you covered the Assembly as well. Talk about why you were simultaneously coordinating with both the Assembly and the Senate, and whether the process was difficult. I guess from my standpoint, it was substantially more difficult in the Assembly than it was in the Senate. But also, you had recognized early on that the city bar itself has a committee called the state laws and uniform state laws and commercial laws. There's a committee within the city bar that Alan Collard chaired. That committee probably is the most knowledgeable, the most experienced committee when it comes to the Uniform Commercial Code. And so you made sure that we were coordinating and keeping that committee up to date because they had a lot of the subject matter experts. But as you just said, you also made sure that we were coordinating with the Uniform Law Commission. Typically, we were coordinating with Edwin Smith, who chaired the committee that adopted the model UCC amendments. And we were coordinating with Professor Neil Cohen, who is now a New York Uniform Law Commissioner. So these subject matter experts, you were coordinating with them, but you were also simultaneously coordinating with, or had us coordinate with, the Assembly and the Senate at the same time. Why was that important?
So the way the legislature works in New York is a little unique, I think, for people who are used to, let's say, the federal process where you could have a Senate bill and a House bill and they pass kind of on their own and then they can reconcile at the end. And you don't necessarily need to make sure that the two bills are exactly the same or that they're in complete alignment because they're sensibly the same bill and they can move through the process and then get reconciled at the end. In New York, that's not the case. So in order for a bill to pass, it needs to pass both the Senate and the Assembly in the same legislative session, which is the same calendar year. And that bill has to be identical when it passes both houses. So if there's an apostrophe out of place but from one bill to the next, it can really derail the ability of a bill to pass. So whenever you're doing this advocacy work, you have to be thinking about both houses and the unique challenges and different strategies that you use in each house. And that changes from issue to issue. So there are certain issues that are easier to move in the Senate. Then there are other issues that are easier to move in the Assembly because of the nature of the legislators and what the majority in that House, some of their viewpoints. Sometimes things are more challenging in the assembly just because it's a bigger body and they have more voices that they need to run issues by, whereas the Senate is a smaller body and they can move things sometimes a little bit more swiftly. So it really varies from issue to issue. And again, that's one of the things that our office really tries to provide our committees is that knowledge and expertise around what's going on politically in each house, what other issues are they dealing with, how are things moving, and where it might be easier to move certain bills in other cases. So in this case, we thought it might be a little easier to start with the Senate, given that our bill sponsor was the chair of the committee that the bill needed to move through. So because Senator Hoylman-Siedel chairs the Judiciary Committee, he controls his agenda much more than just any other. A member of the committee might be able to move a bill if they don't chair it. So that was a huge asset for us in the Senate to be able to move the bill a little bit more easily because he has more a role in actually moving the bill as chair. In the assembly, we were going with, Assembly Member Borres is really more of a subject matter expert. He has a computer science background and is very interested in these types of issues around emerging technologies. So he doesn't chair, though, the committee that the bill needs to get through. So he's helping to push the bill in a different way in the assembly. And that is something that, we just, like I said, filled into our advocacy plan. So we're always taking into account both houses. We also always are trying to talk between both sponsors, because even though the sponsors coordinate, a lot of times it is up to advocates to help bridge gaps between sponsors, to just keep them in the loop. Legislator sponsors sponsor tons of bills. This was one of many bills that both of those legislators were sponsoring and championing. So we need to make sure that even though they're supportive and this is their issue, that they're talking to each other, that they're keeping the bill moving. So it's a lot of moving parts that you're kind of constantly trying to push the ball forward, to slowly but surely keep things moving in the direction that you need it to go, especially for our bill, because there wasn't really ever any stated opposition. There were no concerns about the bill that we ever heard. It was more just needing to educate people, make sure they were aware of the topic, understood what the bill was trying to do, and keeping it on their radar, because the legislature is dealing with hundreds upon hundreds of bills every year. Half of the battle is just getting your issue some attention. So that was the legislative piece. To go back to what you were saying about the committees, I think one of the unique strengths of the city bar is our committees system and the fact that we have experts in so many different areas, and that when we take a position, there's usually multiple committees involved. Even if one committee maybe takes the laboring or of drafting, we have the ability to pull on other committees and their resources when there is overlapping subject matter jurisdiction. So our commercial law and uniform state laws committees works on uniform laws all the time. They are experts in all these areas. So to be able to go to them and have them help us with advocacy efforts, to help us identify organizations to reach out to be able to utilize the resources that they have as well is hugely important to any issue that we're working on, and particularly with this one. So we're always trying to pull on the various strengths that we have throughout the bar, whether that be our committees, whether it be our programming, whether it be our fund programs. We have a lot of resources internally that we can help pull on from an advocacy perspective to push an issue forward and to try to get the attention it needs.
So two questions. The first question is, one of the things that was kind of complicated, and you brought it to our attention right away, was that there was a sense of urgency for this particular bill for two reasons. One internal, one external. The external part is what you alluded to earlier, which is to say, we didn't issue the report until February. So we were essentially bringing this to you in March. The budget is a real big issue in New York, and there's a pretty short time window. I'd like you to talk about that process. And then the second part of it, that call for urgency, we didn't do very well. I want to tell you, our goal was to be the first to have New York be the first to adopt the model amendment that the ULC ALI was working on, that we refer to as the 2022 amendments. And so we wanted to be the first. It ended up that there were 31 states and the District of Columbia were ahead of us. So talk about the pressures and the strategies, because you have a situation where we're trying to make sure that New York continues to be a leader, but these other states were going ahead of us. And we came to you late in the game because we didn't come to you until March. And there's a June deadline, but the budget doesn't actually get passed until pretty late in the process. So talk about those two issues. And then I want to bring you back to what you did in terms of posting things on the website, reaching out to specific organizations, briefing those organizations on a regular basis.
New York is unique in a lot of ways, and one of the ways that we're unique is our legislative process. Obviously, every state is a little different, but New York really operates, given the amount of issues that we deal with, the amount of bills that pass every year, on a very short schedule. So the legislative session every year runs from January until now early June, because they wrap up before the primaries. So we're talking about a less than 6-month period, really, where we're trying to get hundreds of bills. Well, there are thousands of bills actually pending every year that are getting reviewed and put through the process. But in the end, maybe 10% less than that are actually passing. And as you mentioned, you start in January, the governor gives her State of the State address, kind of sets the agenda for the year. And then you almost immediately go into budget negotiations, because the budget comes out in the third week of January. And that really is the main focus of Albany until the budget is done, which should be an April 1 deadline, but usually goes much later than that, depending on what issues are being negotiated, because we have a very complicated budget system in New York. We're not just dealing with dollars and cents. A lot of substantive policy is done within the budget. So the negotiations around the budget are hugely impactful, hugely important, and do dominate the conversation in Albany for those first few months. So that means that even though obviously other legislative actions are happening, it's not as if all business stops while they're working on the budget, but a lot of it is focused on that. So it's really challenging during that time, especially as an organization that does work around the budget and is, advocating for, we put out maybe 70 legislative reports a year. So we're doing a level of advocacy for all of our positions. So it's challenging to constantly be kind of reshuffling the deck and moving issues up and changing what issue you're focused on depending on what's going on at any given moment. So with the budget dominating the conversation, you really have kind of 2 months, if that, to really push the legislature to pass a bill. And so if the first time you're bringing a bill to the legislature is not until, as you said, March, it's really challenging to get anything done that year, unless it's a very simple bill or a very high-level bill that, a lot of people are bought into. Almost certainly you're going to be going into the next year before you can get anything done, which was the case here, where we have a massive piece of legislation. This is a huge bill. It's very technical. It needs to be put into New York's unique bill drafting format. And even though we do our best to get it there before we submit it to the legislature, they have to, at the end of the day, make sure it matches, New York style for this. So getting it through bill drafting, and then actually like the logistical steps of getting it introduced, the kind of administrative steps, I should say, it was half the battle here of just getting the bill introduced. So yeah, March isn't the best time to first introduce a bill, especially one this big, but we were able to at least get it introduced. And then that way we did have a bill number, and it made it a little bit easier for us going into the next year to push things forward, because we had that bill number and we could at least get people behind that. And
the second part of the question is that, remember, when we started down this road, we wanted New York to be the first. I guess we would have been happy if New York was the second, third, or fourth. But New York ended up being, again, at the time, it was a 31st state, or at least there were 31 states before New York, plus the District of Columbia. But you had told us pretty early on, given the size of the bill, given the complexity of the bill, given how things typically play out during session and off session, you told us that this was going to be a heavy lift and that we should expect a multi-year process. So You also had strategies for us because this was so urgent, because we thought New York needed to move fast so that New York could remain a leader. For instance, we literally worked, as I alluded to, during the session, after the session was over, and we kept our pulse on what was going on with the legislation, what the staff of the sponsors were doing. Why was that so important? Why did you have us do that?
Since we're talking about, as I mentioned, a maybe 6-month period where a bill can really move in actuality through the legislature, it's really important to be kind of constantly trying to move the issue forward and to make sure that you're covering all of your bases. So because there are so many different pieces of the puzzle when it comes to getting a bill through the legislature. So you need the bill introduced, you need bill sponsors in each house. You need the bill to get through at least one committee, sometimes more than one committee. So you need to get a bill onto a committee agenda and then get the committee to actually vote the bill out of committee. Then you need to get the bill onto a calendar for the full house to go up for a vote. And then and you have to do that for both houses. And then you have to actually get the governor to sign the bill. And in the case of almost all of those actions, there's nothing that compels the legislature to move a bill forward. I think, when we work with our members who are lawyers, they're used to getting, they have set trial dates. There's always an end to something. There's a resolution one way or the other. That's not the case in the legislative process. In a lot of cases, bills will sit for years and not necessarily move. And if it's your bill and you're not advancing it and keeping it on people's radar, there's nothing to compel the legislature that they have to listen to that they have to move this issue. They don't have to hear your arguments. They don't have to care about something. They can just let it sit. So it's important for us to always be thinking about how do we get this issue attention at times that are impactful, right? So it would be great if the bill got attention in the summer and we would take it. But at the end of the day, if the bill hasn't moved, then it's getting attention in the summer, but it can't actually move forward. So you want to try to get attention for it at times when the legislature can do something about it. You want to make sure that you're, talking to legislators when they can actually affect the change. So let's say you need bill amendments or things like that. That's stuff that can maybe be done off session. So one of our big hurdles in this case was trying to get the bill to be amended to be the full text and the text as we wanted it introduced. That process we were able to do during the off session when the legislature wasn't actively meeting, because that's probably the best time to get amendments in, because bill drafting can just focus on that and they have less bills that they're worried about. So using that off session to make sure that we were talking to the sponsors, getting things to bill drafting, getting other groups to try to nudge people to move the bill along was really helpful. We also try to, as I said, find times throughout the year that we're talking about this issue to whoever we need to speak to. So for instance, if we meet with the governor's office in the fall about the city bar's priorities, we want to make sure we're talking about the bill. Even though the bill hasn't necessarily gone to the governor's office yet, we want them to be aware of it. We don't want the first time that they ever hear about an issue to be when the bill comes across their desk. We want them to have some information in advance. And the same thing goes for leadership. So making sure the speaker's office was aware of the issue even before they had to worry about it, because we wanted it to be something that they were like, oh yeah, the city bar cares about this. Oh, this is an issue that is going to come before us. Maybe at some point we at least have some knowledge of it and we're not first hearing about it when we're considering whether or not to put it up for a vote. So given, as I mentioned before, the volume of bills that Albany is dealing with, you want to look for any opportunity to get your issue before the people who need to make the decision so that they're aware of it, that they're thinking about it. And that requires kind of a year-long strategy that we adjust as we go along. Using the off session, for instance, to try to get other groups involved is a good use of your time, because if you have supporters lined up before session starts, you can quickly mobilize them then when there's actual action happening during the session. So, I kind of have my advocacy plan that we have for the committees, and we're constantly tinkering with it, updating it, adding things as we go along to make sure that it's reflective of what's going on, and also of kind of changing situation on the ground, and so that we're being responsive to what's going on.
I was really impressed and surprised at how hands-on you were. You actually drafted numerous documents. We all reviewed everything that was drafted, whether you drafted or I drafted or Edwin Smith or Neil Cohen. But you were drafting, you posted things to the website. As I said, we talked about it, and we needed model letters that people could write to the assemblyman or to the senator or to other senators or other assemblymen. You also coordinated with and briefed various groups within the city, the stakeholders who were really interested in making sure that this occurred. And, I didn't realize how hands-on the policy department was. It's not someone who's just sitting back and saying, go do this, go do that. The task force led, but without the policy department, I don't think the task force would have been able to move the way we were moving. So where do you find the time to do all of that?
Luckily, it's my job. So we are really aware of the fact that our members are volunteers, that you all are doing this in addition to your day jobs, that this is not the sole thing that you work on, but it is what we work on. So our goal is to really give voice to our committees are our voice, and we try to give further voice and make sure that voice is being heard by whoever needs to hear it. And I think it's one of those things, I don't think, all of our members are aware of the fact that, I'm a registered lobbyist. I lobby on behalf of the city bar. My colleagues lobby as well on behalf of the city bar. We are always looking for opportunities to advance our voice, whatever that may be. And when we have committee members that are particularly interested in advocating for an issue, we want to make sure that we're meeting that interest and that need. Because at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure our members are getting out of their policy work what they need. So in some cases, committees are happy to write reports. They go on our website. We get them out to the right people who need to see them. We maybe get them to some other organizations that are working on an issue, but that's kind of the extent of what we're doing. In cases like this, where we have a really dedicated committee, or in this case, a task force, who want to do kind of the on-the-ground lobbying and advocacy, we help facilitate that however we can. And in my mind, that means making sure that, our report, which is really kind of like the lifeblood of this project, right? All of the work that went into the report is seen in as many ways as it can be. And we know that, legislators don't necessarily always have the time to sit and read a 30-page report. So finding the time to maybe create one-pagers or documents that are more easily digestible for advocacy purposes, making sure that we're thinking strategically and creatively about how we can get the message out there. So in some cases, for some of our campaigns, social media makes a lot of sense because we want to be educating maybe more general members of the public. Sometimes we'll do action alerts for members. We'll do letter writing, as you mentioned. We'll put together form letters that groups or individuals can send. Like I mentioned, we really try to tailor all of our strategies around the specific issue and what it calls for. So for an issue like this, having the key stakeholders, which would be in this case us, from Law Commission, the other groups that we were able to get involved, we didn't necessarily need members of the public reaching out to the governor's office because for the most part, they have no idea what's going on in the Uniform Commercial Code. They want to make sure that, they're able to conduct business the way they're used to, but they're not thinking about the UCC. So, to do that kind of mobilization outside of our directly impacted members wasn't necessarily necessary. But there are other instances where we've tried to get, the broader public involved and educated around an issue. So we really work closely with committees to make sure that they're getting from the experience what they need, but also that the specific issue that we're working on is getting the kind of the correct treatment to see it through to fruition.
One of the other interesting things that I was not aware of was the extent to which you coordinated internally within the city bar. It's not an exaggeration to say that, for example, Eli, who produces all of the task force podcasts, you coordinated with Eli because when we needed to have a podcast, Eli is our go-to person. When we needed a press release, Eric was our go-to person. When we needed to do a webinar or seminar, Martha was a person. you even pulled in 2 city bar presidents, Susan Coleman, who was at the end of her term, and then Mohammed Faridi, who was coming in at the new president. In fact, you and Mohammed actually went to Albany together in support of a number of bills from the city bar, including the task force project to try to modernize the New York UCC. So talk about that process, because one of the things that was critically important was that we have things run really smoothly, because things have to be cleared. The city bar is not a process where every 150 plus committees can just do what they want to do. There are processes for review, and it's pretty rigorous review. But you led the way in all of those so that we had a really smooth process, and we had support from all of the groups that you pulled in. So could you talk about that as well?
I think another unique piece of the city bar is exactly what you're saying, that we have all of these internal resources, and maybe for our members it kind of looks like a seamless behind the scenes, when you see the city bar, it's just the city bar, but we do have a lot of different departments who work in tandem and in collaboration around our issues, and we're kind of constantly behind the scenes talking to each other about the projects that we're working on and trying to advance those in different ways. So, the policy department works hand in glove with our communications department when it comes to all of our materials. We meet weekly to talk about all of the reports and what we're doing, what campaigns we have going on, coordinating on things like you mentioned, press releases, but also blog posts, the newsletter, the podcasts, any sort of communication piece, media mentions, everything like that, trying to get our issues covered in publications. That's all done in collaboration with our communications department. We have the benefit of having a very robust programs and CLE department that can put on a program very quickly, that can be reached by all sorts of people, that lives on our website or, convenes people in our building. It's a really unique feature, I think, for us to be able to be a convener of the profession, both within the 4 walls of the city bar, but also through our website. And we are constantly looking for opportunities to leverage projects across the departments. So there's a lot of overlap between everyone. And as you mentioned, our president is also another great resource that we have, in that we have this leader of the association. They change every 3 years, but they come in and are able to really be the voice, the externally facing voice of the city bar, and speak on the issues that our committees care about. All of our positions are read and approved by the city bar's presidents. I think that's a unique feature of the city bar. Not every organization has that kind of policy where their president is actually, reading and approving everything, but ours do. And I think that really helps us, because they are able to then go out and be an advocate for a lot of these issues and help speak to what the priorities and the policies of the city bar is promoting. And that's something that we were able to do, as you mentioned, with both Susan and Mohammed on these issues. So it's a really wonderful way for us to bring in the various resources that we have to not only our broader membership, but also to the profession and then, the rest of the world.
It was kind of easy for the task force, because Maria Salente, at the time she was with the policy department, she literally said to Lorraine and me, "I'm going to hand you over to Elizabeth Kocienda. You're going to be in good hands." And she literally brought us together. For the chairs who are listening to this and they want to get involved with the policy department because they want to make a difference in terms of the laws in New York, how should they approach it? It's not always going to be the case that somebody from the policy department is going to take you and then bring you to you. What's the process? How should they get involved?
So we try to have on our website, we actually have a bunch of resources there, that including a best practices document that talks about some of the ways that you can get the most out of your committee experience. And one of them is involving us early and seeing us as a partner and somebody that you should communicate with. So we always encourage our committees, when we try to do this, when the chairs meet with the president, when we kind of have communications with the committee chairs every year, where we encourage them to see us as a resource, to reach out to us with questions, to have us speak at their committees. We try to make ourselves really available to our members so that they know that we're there. But the earlier in the process you can involve us is always helpful, because then we can get thinking about things. We can encourage committees to collaborate, let's say, with other committees that they might need to on a particular project. We can give them things to think about when it comes to drafting reports in terms of some of the political realities. We could talk about things like timing, like, hey, you might want to try to get a report done earlier in the year or over the summer, so that way we have a lot of time to work on things. We really try to be a resource as early on in the process as we can be for our members. The other thing I think that is helpful for committees to know is that even when we do our best actually to be always identifying and trying to come to you when we think that there are issues that we can advocate for. So because our department works, so closely together, there's never a time that I don't know about a report going out and can say like, oh, this is a piece of legislation. Let's see if they want to get more involved in advocacy. We kind of always are encouraging committees to say, if you want to do more, here are some ways that you can do more. And we try to find issues that it makes particular sense maybe for us to get more involved in. It doesn't always work. Maybe the committee's not interested, or maybe it's just, given the volume of issues, we can't focus on every single thing. But we do try to proactively reach out to committees when we can to encourage them, particularly when we're talking about a bill that we've drafted entirely ourselves, or that we are really the main drafters or main proponents of. If we're not involved in advocating for it, and from kind of step one, really getting involved in the advocacy, then it makes it really hard to move those issues. So we try to insert ourselves as early as we can in the process.
Thanks, Elizabeth. You and Lorraine have been extremely educational in context and history in terms of how this process worked with the modernization of the Uniform Commercial Code. As I indicated earlier, there's this educational process with kind of how the law is made. And then we will have two subject matter experts, Edwin Smith and Neil Cohen, who will get into the substance of the law. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ed Smith, and he and Neil Cohen will take it away from here.
Today's podcast is brought to you by one of the over 150 City Bar committees. If you're a City Bar member and want to become involved with work like this, with creating programming on cutting-edge topics, with shaping public policy, or to build relationships with professionals in your practice area, join a committee today by logging into your City Bar account at nycbar.org and clicking Join a Committee.
Hello, everyone. This is Ed Smith. I'm at Morgan, Lewis & Bockius. I have offices in New York and Boston, and I'm here with Professor Neil Cohen from Brooklyn Law School. We're happy to tell you a little bit about the 2022 amendments to the UCC and the bill in New York to enact those amendments. I'm a Uniform Law Commissioner. I was the chair of the committee that drafted these amendments. And Neil was an American Law Institute representative on the committee and very active in getting the amendments done. What we're going to do is talk to you about a few subjects where Neil's going to provide an overview. Then we're going to go into what's actually in these 2022 amendments. Then we're going to talk about what little differences there are between the official text as promulgated by the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission in the New York bill. And then we'll go through some transition issues. So, Neil, I'm going to turn things over to you to provide an overview.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. And 2022 amendments to the Uniform Commercial Code that deal with emerging technology issues. And as he mentioned, was the chair of the drafting committee that produced these, and I served on it. I'm on the faculty of Brooklyn Law School, and I'm also the director of research of the permanent editorial board for the Uniform Commercial Code. Why do these amendments exist? Why are we talking about these things now? And that's because, as everyone who's engaged in commercial transactions knows, technological revolutions of the last several years have really brought about significant changes in commercial transactions. And these changes have occurred on a lot of fronts. There have been new subjects of commerce, things that didn't exist before or didn't exist in their current form, things like cryptocurrencies and other digital assets. There's been a development in transactions that blend the old with the new, transactions involving digital assets or tokens linked to real world assets like accounts receivable and the like. There's an increasing number of what we sometimes call hybrid transactions that have some elements in the old tech world, like goods, and some elements in the new tech world, like information flows and the like. And finally, methods of commerce have changed. Methods of payments have changed. People in trade finance, for example, have for years wanted to have the electronic equivalent of promissory notes and bills of exchange. And as a result of these developments in commerce that are continuing, but have been developing now for several years, in 2019, the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission instituted, I should say, an effort to examine the Uniform Commercial Code to see if it was up to the task of governing these emerging technology transactions. And it was a 3-year process to develop these amendments. Ed will tell us about that process in a few minutes. The result of this process was the promulgation by those two sponsoring organizations, the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission, in 2022 of some significant revisions to the official text of the Uniform Commercial Code. The effort to enact those amendments across the country began in 2023, and as of now, 31 states and the District of Columbia have revised their Uniform Commercial Codes in accordance with the recommended official text of the emerging technology amendments. Yeah, do you want to tell us a little bit more about the process of developing the amendments and talk about some of the things that are addressed in them?
Sure. It wasn't a 3-year process. That was a lot taller before we started. It was quite an experience. We had 15 drafting committee meetings. We had about 300 observers. I felt like I was dealing with the cast of Ben-Hur, but we had a lot of active participation from people in academia, practitioners, governmental organizations, of people who were dealing with some of these technological developments. And then the product was approved by the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission in 2022. So what is in these amendments? Well, we start with a brand new Article 12 of the Uniform Commercial Code dealing with something called a controllable electronic record. Now, this is really, some people would say, a digital asset, but it's a digital asset that we care about because it really has value. Elements are that it's a record, and the UCC has a definition of record, which would include a writing, but also an electronic record. But this record needs to be electronic, and it needs to be subject to control. That's why it's a controllable electronic record. Now, what do we mean by control? We really mean something that has the attributes analogous to possession of a physical object. So to have control, if I claim I have control of this controllable electronic record, it's because I'm able to enjoy substantially all the benefits of that record. I'm able to keep other people from enjoying those benefits. I'm the one who is able to transfer that record to someone else, and I can identify myself as someone who has all of these rights. Now, the easiest way to think about a controllable electronic record is to think about cryptocurrency. If I have the private keys in my wallet for my wallet, I'm the one who can enjoy substantially all the benefits of that cryptocurrency. I'm the one who can keep others from enjoying those benefits. I'm the one who can spend that cryptocurrency, and I can identify myself through my public key as having control. But this also applies to other types of digital assets, including non-fungible tokens and some others that we're going to talk about. Now, if we have a controllable electronic record, why do we care? We care because we create some commercial law rules for the rights of a transferee of that record. If Neil is in control of a controllable electronic record and he transfers it to me, then I get all the rights that Neil has in that record. if I'm a special type of transferee, a qualifying purchaser, someone who is equivalent to a good faith purchaser of a no negotiable instrument, somebody who takes for value in good faith without notice of an adverse claim, then I get all of those rights that Neil had, but free of competing property claims. So if you think about cryptocurrency, or you think especially today about stable coins, how critical this is that stable coins be treated like money. And they can't be treated like money before these 2022 amendments because there's no adverse claim cutoff rule. There's no way to cut off claims of competing ownership to this particular asset. Now, we also recognize that you could have a controllable electronic record that embodies some other right. You've heard about people tokenizing real-world assets, tokenizing real estate, tokenizing securities. The Uniform Commercial Code amendments don't deal with those. They leave that to other law to determine what rights travel with the controllable electronic record, but with a big exception. And the big exception is payment rights. When you have a controllable electronic record that evidences a right to payment that would be an account or a payment intangible under the Uniform Commercial Code, then that payment right travels with the controllable electronic record. So if there were a right to payment that was evidenced by a controllable electronic record and Neil transferred it to me, I would get whatever rights Neil had in that payment right. And I would also, if I'm a qualifying purchaser, be able to cut off adverse claims to that right. Now, security interests in those payment rights that are accounts or payment intangibles are governed by Article 9, and the term security interest includes a sale of those payment rights. One of the virtues of these amendments is that it's possible to perfect a security interest in one of these accounts or payment intangibles, what we call controllable accounts, or controllable payment intangibles evidenced by a controllable electronic record. You can perfect by control. So this eliminates the need for people who are lending against these assets to do UCC searches if they can get control, if they can get the cryptocurrency, for example, transferred into their wallet or held with someone else. Now, even though we've talked about controllable electronic records generally as being evidencing certain types of digital assets, there are provisions of the Uniform Commercial Code that work very, very well already, and those types of transactions are excluded from being a controllable electronic record. So investment property under UCC Article 8, chattel paper in electronic form, transferable records under the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, electronic documents of title, those are all excluded. We're trying to narrow down those areas where we feel a need for the legal rules. And then when you're dealing with payment rights, of course, there has to be some protection for the obligors on those payment rights, what we call under the UCC the account debtors. To have a controllable account or controllable payment intangible, the account debtor has to agree to pay the person in control. And in order for the transferee to tell the account debtor to pay the transferee rather than someone else, there needs to be a method built into the controllable electronic record for the account debtor to know who to pay. On a platform, this should be fairly easy if the account debtor has access to the platform because it can tell who is in control of the controllable electronic record. Of course, when you're dealing with individual states enacting statutes, and you're also dealing with transactions that span the globe, there need to be choice of law issues. And to determine whether any of these substantive law rules apply in a particular forum, we look to what's called the controllable electronic records jurisdiction. Now, what is that jurisdiction? Well, if the controllable electronic record actually has a governing law contained in it, then that jurisdiction is the jurisdiction of the controllable electronic record. If not, if the system in which it is recorded has a set of legal rules or the governing law, a playbook, then that governing law points to the jurisdiction that's the jurisdiction of the controllable electronic record. And if neither of those apply, which would be typical for, let's say, Bitcoin, which does not have a governing law. Then you look to the law of Washington, D.C., which has enacted these amendments, so you apply the substantive law rules that way. Now, of course, there's no way that we can know for sure that these amendments will be applied if a dispute arises in a foreign jurisdiction, but there may be ways through choice of law and choice of forum clauses to minimize the risk that these amendments will not be applied. So, Neil, tell us a little bit more about these electronic payment rights.
Well, thanks so much, Ed. As you pointed out, one of the interesting things about this package of amendments is that it addresses not only controllable electronic records, but payment rights that are tethered to or connected to those controllable electronic records, accounts receivable and the like. One important implication of the fact that's included in these amendments is something that you never quite see directly in the text of the statute, but is a very important implication of the rules. And that has to do with the ability to construct what is essentially the electronic equivalent of negotiable instruments. Listeners who remember the law of negotiable instruments will recall that there are two great advantages to a payment right being embodied in a negotiable instrument, and they both come from the fact that a transferee of the negotiable instrument can have a very special status in commercial law. It's called being a holder in due course. And if you are a holder in due course of a negotiable instrument, you get two great rights. One is that you take the instrument free of competing claims of ownership to that instrument. And the second one is, if it embodies a payment obligation, like a promissory note, you take free of most defenses that the obligor on the promissory note could raise. And those two benefits of being a holder in due course tend to make a negotiable instrument more valuable than a simple promise to pay money. Well, if one goes through the rules that Ed described, we'll see that, as he mentioned, in the case of a controllable electronic record, one can be a qualifying purchaser of that controllable electronic record, and as a result, take free of competing property claims. So that is essentially the same as the freedom from property claims aspect of holder in due course status. The other aspect of holder in due course status is, again, freedom from defenses that could be raised, or most defenses that could be raised by the obligor. That's given automatically by holder in due course status. But Article 9 of the UCC already provides that for receivables that are sold, that by contract, it can be agreed that an obligor will not raise against subsequent assignees of the payment right the same types of defenses that can't be raised against a holder in due course. And the result is we have, by embodying a payment right in a controllable electronic record, we have the ability to create something that's essentially a electronic negotiable instrument, which is not something that was possible under prior law. But controllable electronic records aren't the only issue that are addressed, that is addressed in these emerging technology amendments. Emerging technology has affected transactions really across the Uniform Commercial Code. One basic example can come from Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code that deals with the sale of goods. But as has been obvious really since the beginning of the Uniform Commercial Code, a lot of transactions don't just involve goods. They involve goods and something else. It might be goods and services, goods and real estate. Nowadays, it's goods and emerging technology assets. It can be goods and different types of information. It can be goods and intellectual property rights. It can be goods and lots of other things. Almost any of the smart devices we have in our homes are goods, but that embody other services that come along with them that just didn't exist as a matter of technology a decade ago. Well, how does the Uniform Commercial Code deal with this? The original Uniform Commercial Code, original Article 2, ignored the issue. It tells us that Article 2 governs transactions in goods and is silent about transactions that involve goods and something else. What law do you apply to those transactions? The result was that courts had to fill that gap. And over the years, courts in most states concluded that if you have a mixed or hybrid transaction of this sort, that the way we determine which law governed when contract law differed from law of sale of goods in Article 2 which was to see what the predominant purpose of the transaction was. And if a court concluded that the predominant purpose of the transaction was the goods aspect, then it would apply Article 2 to the whole transaction. While if the predominant purpose was not the goods aspect, but the other aspects, it would apply other law, typically the common law of contracts, to that contract. That's been a fairly stable judicial resolution, except it's often ignored because if you have a transaction in which the goods do not predominate, but there's a problem with the goods, courts tend to find a way to apply Article 2 rules about sale of goods to the problems with the goods. Well, the revisions to Article 2 and 2A for leases that are part of these emerging technology amendments bring about this common sense solution. They tell us that if the goods aspect of a contract predominates, then Article 2 for sales or Article 2A for leases applies to the entire transaction. But even if the goods aspect doesn't predominate, the provisions of the UCC that deal primarily with the goods as opposed to the transaction as a whole can apply to the goods. And this is very important so that if you have a hybrid transaction in which the problem is the goods are faulty, even if the goods aspect doesn't dominate the transaction, things like Article 2 warranties can apply. And so we have a more sensible resolution of what happens in these hybrid transactions. And similar hybrid issues arise in the context of chattel paper, because the definition of chattel paper refers to a security interest in goods. But again, you can have a hybrid transaction. Ed, how does it work out for chattel paper?
Well, Neil, thank you. A similar concept applies. There are really three changes that go on that deal with chattel paper. And just for those of you who are not familiar with UCC terminology, chattel paper is a promise to pay secured by a security interest in or a lease of goods. So it has very broad application, especially in the auto finance area, but in many other areas as well. One was the distinction under the pre-2022 amendments UCC between tangible chattel paper and electronic chattel paper is now gone. There's just chattel paper, and that's really because it was very hard to figure out sometimes in a transaction which was which. You can have a transaction that starts off in paper and goes electronic, or vice versa. So the rules are collapsed, and occasionally we refer to chattel paper in electronic form or chattel paper in tangible form. The second area is the one that Neil just mentioned. When you have a transaction that is a mixed transaction and you're trying to figure out whether the chattel paper rules apply, you look at the predominant purpose test to see whether the predominant purpose was to acquire the use or possession of the goods. And if so, then you have chattel paper. The third area is to expand the concept of control of the chattel paper in electronic form to pick up distributed ledger technology. So the control definition is really much more flexible under the 2022 amendments than under the pre-2022 amendments UCC, or even under the pre-2022 amendments New York Uniform Commercial Code. There is a similar expansion of the definition of control for electronic documents of title to pick up distributed ledger technology. Now, Neil, we also had a whole bunch of writing requirements in the pre-2022 amendments UCC, and how did we address those?
That's a very good point, Ed. The 2022 amendments continued a process that really began at the beginning of the 2000s when the Uniform Commercial Code gradually replaced writing requirements with requirements that something be done in writing or essentially its electronic equivalent. And the term record has often been used to embody the electronic equivalent of a writing. Similarly, the concept of signing, putting one's pen to paper, was augmented starting in the early 2000s with the ability to do the electronic equivalent of signing. But many of those requirements, both for writings and signatures, remained in the Uniform Commercial Code. And the conclusion was reached that really there was no reason to require an otherwise electronic transaction to have a couple of aspects of it nonetheless be in the old tech of paper and pen. And so for the most part, requirements of a writing or of a signed writing have been replaced by their electronic equivalent in the newest version of the statute. There are a couple other changes that we should probably note along the way as well. And how about this thing about commercial tort claims?
Yeah. Well, the commercial tort claims has been a real interesting problem under the pre-2022 amendments of Article 9. As a lot of you know, if you're going to take a security interest in a commercial tort claim, its original collateral, you've got to describe it more specifically than by type. And that's to really show that the secured party is relying on that commercial tort claim as collateral and extending credit. Where courts have been confused is not where the commercial tort claim is original collateral, but where it's proceeds of other collateral. If I have a security interest in a piece of equipment and somebody torches that piece of equipment, and then the debtor has a claim against the tortfeasor, and that claim is proceeds of the equipment, which is now worth less. The tort claim is intended to compensate the secured party from the loss of the value of the equipment collateral. But some courts have said, well, even that proceeds claim has to be described more specifically. And even if the claim is settled and you have a contract that involves the tortfeasor making a payment under the settlement agreement, that needs to be described more specifically. And we say in these 2022 amendments that that's not the case, that you don't need to have a more specific description when you have proceeds of a commercial tort claim. So, Neil, what about the definition of conspicuous that appears in all these warranty provisions?
Well, thanks, Ed. As you just said, warranty provisions in the UCC, which are primarily in Article 2 for sale of goods or Article 2A for lease of goods, typically provide that when the seller or the lessor is a merchant, that the goods have to have certain characteristics, particularly that they have to be merchantable. And Article 2 and Article 2A list the 6 or so criteria of merchantability. And similarly, not only is there this implied warranty of merchantability, but in some circumstances, there's an implied warranty that the goods will be fit for the buyer or lessee's particular purpose. These are called implied warranties because the law reads them in, even if the parties didn't explicitly agree to them. But the law that provides these implied warranties also provides for a way for the seller and the buyer to contract such that those warranties don't apply, make it possible to buy goods as is, for example, where the buyer gets less protection, but typically, pays a lower price for the goods. And the key to the rules that talk about how a contract can disclaim implied warranties is that the disclaimer has to be conspicuous. Can't be hidden in microdots on page 47 of a 348-page contract. Well, what does conspicuous mean? It's actually a term that's defined in the text of the Uniform Commercial Code in Article 1 of the UCC that contains definitions for terms used throughout the code. And the heart of that definition has always been that conspicuous with respect to a term in the contract, it has to be written or displayed in such a way that a reasonable person against which it is to operate ought to have noticed it. What does that really mean? Well, the old official text of the UCC went on beyond that sentence to give examples, almost safe harbors, of what things would qualify as being conspicuous. And all of them tended to assume that we were talking about a printed text on an 8x11 sheet of paper with normal margins and readable type and the like. New York, many years ago, got rid of those examples and left the basic definition presented so that a reasonable person against which the language is to operate ought to have noticed it. Even then, that language didn't provide much guidance in a world of electronic communications. So what the new text of this definition does, again, in other states, it gets rid of those safe harbors. In New York, we already did, and adds in one new phrase that by itself doesn't tell us much, but there's a little bit more to it. The new phrase that's added is that the conclusion that the presentation has to be such that a reasonable person ought to have noticed it. But that determination is now based on the totality of the circumstances. And there's an official comment that goes with this new definition of conspicuous. Those of you who know the Uniform Commercial Code know that it comes with official comments. And even though the legislature doesn't actually enact the official comments, they're typically presented along with the text of the statute in almost every state's statute book, and judges rely extensively on the official comments in interpreting the statute. And the official comment with respect to the definition of conspicuous points out that life isn't simple anymore, because in the old days, when the contract was typically prepared by the seller or the lessor, the piece of paper was prepared by the seller or the lessor, and that seller or lessor can make the typeface bigger and put things in capital letters or the like, and everyone would know how the buyer or lessee would see that language. But nowadays, people enter into transactions for the sale of goods or the lease of goods through all sorts of media. Some people do it on a printed sheet of paper. Other people look on their desktop computer with a 28 or 35-inch screen. Other people look on their telephones with a 4-inch diagonal screen or the like. And what's conspicuous in one form isn't necessarily conspicuous in another form. And yet the seller will make its goods available on all sorts of different devices. And so what the comments talk about is, one is the seller's responsibility in this context, and the seller has to take into account the variety of circumstances in which the buyer or the lessee might look at this language to conclude whether it's conspicuous. So it is a bit more realistic for a modern electronic contracting environment than the old rule that simply assumed we had a piece of paper and the seller could control the presentation of that piece of paper. So this is something that will benefit buyers and lessees by having a situation where it's a bit easier for them to notice terms that they need to know about in the case of a contract for the sale of goods.
Neil, why don't we move on at this point to the New York legislation and how it differs from the uniform text? And here we really do have to thank the city bar for a major role in getting this refined, getting the changes that Neil is going to be talking about, and getting this through the state legislatures, especially the City Bar Presidential Task Force on Artificial Intelligence, Digital Technologies, very ably led by Jerome Walker and Lorraine McGowan, and the Uniform State Laws Committee that Alan Colad chaired at the time. So, Neil, why don't you tell us what this group accomplished?
Thanks, Ed. We call this statute the Uniform Commercial Code, but in some ways that's an aspirational title rather than an exact title. It's really the substantially or mostly Uniform Commercial Code. And when each state enacts the text supplied by the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission, ultimately it's that state's legislature that chooses the text of the law. And typically the legislature will examine the official text that's sent by those sponsoring organizations and see if there are any adjustments that need to be made, any tailoring that needs to be done to reflect things that are unique to that state. And as Ed pointed out, the city bar committees looked at the proposed statute in some significant detail, and there was recognition that there was some tailoring that was needed for the situation of New York. And there are, in fact, really 4 types of deviations in the New York text from the official text of the 2022 amendments. The first deviation comes from the fact that New York is a bit of an oddball in the world of negotiable instruments. In 1990, the American Law Institute and the Uniform Law Commission promulgated a totally rewritten version of Articles 3 and 4 of the Uniform Commercial Code dealing with negotiable instruments and the like. Eventually, every state but New York enacted those amendments, and some states went even further and adopted an even more modern version that was promulgated by a committee chaired by Ed in 2002. New York hasn't adopted those either. Well, the 2022 amendments assume that a state has enacted those revisions to Articles 3 and 4 of the Uniform Commercial Code. Because New York has not, there were parts of the emerging technology amendments that had to be slightly rewritten for New York's purposes so that it would match with New York's existing old Articles 3 and 4 of the Uniform Commercial Code rather than the more modern version that's in effect in other states. So that's one difference between the New York bill and the official text. Another difference has to do with the fact that the last time that Article 9 was amended across the country dealing with secured transactions, the 2010 amendments to Article 9, New York did enact those amendments in 2014, but it enacted them somewhat incompletely and a little bit idiosyncratically. But that was the policy decision made by the legislature back in 2014, and the decision was made to respect that decision of the legislature from 2014. And so the 2022 amendments, as embodied in the New York bill, reflect those slight uniformities that were introduced back a decade ago when the 2010 amendments to Article 9 were enacted. A third difference between the New York bill and the uniform text has to do with something Ed mentioned a little bit earlier, the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act, often referred to as UETA or UETA. Every state except New York has enacted the Uniform Electronic Transactions Act. New York has a statute that addresses many, but perhaps not all of the issues addressed in UETA, in a statute called New York's Electronic Signatures and Records Act, sometimes called ESRA. ESRA, in many ways, is similar to UETA, but it differs in some material respects from the UETA because New York doesn't have UETA, and yet the 2022 amendments in their official form assume that an enacting state has enacted the UETA. The New York bill has been adjusted to make sure there are no unintended consequences from the meshing of the 2022 amendments and our somewhat unique ESRA as opposed to the UETA. And so that was the source of some tweaking. And finally, New York has long had a unique rule that makes it easier than in other states for a good faith purchaser of a negotiable instrument to qualify basically for a holder in due course status and get freedom from adverse claims to that instrument. One of the key criteria for qualifying as a holder in due course is to be without notice of adverse claims, without notice of defenses. Well, New York has historically, dating back now over a century, New York has had a very narrow definition of what constitutes notice for these purposes. Basically, you have to have either known about something or been acting in bad faith to avoid learning about it in order to have notice of a claim. And that is a somewhat more restrictive definition of notice, making it easier to take free of adverse claims. That's in New York law than in other states. The New York text of the 2022 amendments carries forth this important New York policy that makes it easier to create negotiable instruments, easier for payment obligations to move in commerce. And again, the New York bill keeps and moves forward this unique New York policy.
So, Neil, now that we've learned a little bit about what the amendments contain and how the New York bill just differs slightly from the official text, what about transition? How do people need to fasten their seatbelts as this bill becomes law?
Good question, Ed. There's a couple transition issues that people need to focus on. The first one is the effective date of the statute. And the New York bill provides that the bill becomes effective the new rules become effective 180 days after the bill becomes law. And so once Governor Hochul signs this, 180 days from then, the new rules will go into effect. But life doesn't stop the day before the new rules go into effect and restart the next day. Many things in life continue before and after any particular date. And so we need rules to determine when the new law applies, when the new rules apply, and when the old rules might continue to apply. And these are usually called transition rules that govern the transition from the former legal regime to the new legal regime. And there are two sets of transition rules in the 2022 amendments and the emerging technology amendments. The first set deals with essentially everything in the package except for Articles 9 and 12. Articles 9 and 12 dealing with controllable electronic records in Article 12 and security interests in them in Article 9 have their own special rule. But for everything else, it's a fairly simple rule, which is old law applies and continues to apply to transactions entered into before the effective date, transactions entered into after the effective date, the new law will apply to. But more complicated for controllable electronic records and security interests in them, isn't it, Ed?
Well, it's only more complicated in one respect, and that is because once these amendments go into effect, perfection by control of a controllable electronic record beats perfection by filing or some other method. So you could have, before the amendments, a lender who is lending against, let's say, crypto. The cryptocurrency is in the lender's account. The lender did not file a financing statement to perfect its interest. That then lender 2 comes along and files a financing statement to perfect the security interest in the same cryptocurrency. Before the amendments, lender 2 would have priority over lender 1. But once the amendments go into effect, we flip the priorities. Lender 1 has priority because it has control over lender 2. But we have a grace period of a year for lender 2 to get its act together and try to preserve its pre-amendments priority if it wants to. That's the end of that 1-year period is called the adjustment date. But that's really the only big complication. Neil, the real complication, I think, is the fact that we don't have all states online. We have some states that have not enacted these amendments, even though 31 states in the District of Columbia have.
That's right, Ed. And that's until all 50 states have enacted these 2022 amendments, we're necessarily going to have situations in transactions that involve more than one state, which is to say a very high percentage of transactions, where one of the states that's involved or potentially involved has enacted the 2022 amendments, and another state that's involved has not enacted the 2022 amendments, in which case we have to figure out which law governs. And that question really has to be answered at least 2 points. One is when you're planning a transaction and you're figuring out how to do it and where you have to file. Can you get rights by taking control of an asset or the like? You have to know whether the new law governs this or the old law, when one of the states has the new law and one has the old law. The other time, of course, one needs to know is if there's a dispute later on. A court will have to resolve the dispute based on what the law is. Well, if the law is different in different states, the court has to make a determination of which state's law will govern. Of course, the best way to deal with issues like this is to deal with them going in when you're entering into the transaction and planning it, so you know what needs to be done and what needs to be done where. But here's where it gets a little complicated, because rules that determine which law governs, usually referred to as choice of law rules, are laws of a forum. They're laws that govern which law a court should apply. And so the choice of law rules in effect in New York tell the New York court which state's law to apply. The choice of law rules in effect in Maine tell a Maine court which law to apply. Well, if we have 31 states that have enacted the new law, which comes with its own choice of law rules, and as Ed pointed out earlier, sometimes that will point to District of Columbia, sometimes it'll point to the law designated by a system or the law designated in the controllable electronic record. We have a situation where, depending on where litigation takes place, the court may be in a state that's enacted the new rules, in which case the new choice of law rule will apply, or the court might be in a state that has not yet enacted the 2022 amendments, in which case it will apply the old law choice of law rules, which might sometimes point to a different state. Well, what state is pointed to? Sometimes it's the state in which an Article 9 debtor is located. Sometimes it's the controllable electronic records jurisdiction. What if that state has enacted the 2022 amendments or has not enacted the 2022 amendments? Again, that's something that a court will have to figure out. So we have 2 inflection points that will make things complicated until all the states have enacted this. One is different state courts will apply different choice of law rules. And the second is that those choice of law rules may point to a state that has enacted the 2022 amendments, and they may point to a state that has not enacted the 2022 amendments. And so until we have nationwide enactment of the 2022 amendments, parties that are entering into transactions are probably well advised to do a little bit of belt and suspenders, to analyze the transaction as though it will be litigated in a state that has enacted the amendments and follow through the choice of law rules and do what that law tells the party to do, and also make the alternate assumption that it'll be litigated in a state that hasn't yet enacted the 2022 amendments and follow that through. It's going to be a little bit of a pain in the neck for a while, but hopefully remaining states will finish up and this issue will be a relic of the past.
So, Neil, we've thrown a lot at our audience point. Hope everyone has gotten whatever information they were looking for from us. We're happy to do other programs if there are interest. We are incredibly grateful to the City Bar and the Presidential Task Force and the Uniform State Laws Committee for all the work that they have done in moving New York forward on these amendments. And we're hopeful that there will be a lot of transactions that develop over time that profit from these amendments. Neil, any parting words?
Just to thank everyone for their attention to this and for these very important issues and for all the organizations Ed mentioned that helped us to develop this. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen and Jalen Martin.